The views expressed on this podcast are those of the participants, not of Reuters News.
We're going to be paying down debt. We're going to be reducing taxes. We can do things that nobody else can do. Nobody else is going to be able to do it. China doesn't have what we have. Nobody has what we have. But we have the greatest people also. Maybe that's the most important thing.
What once looked to be shaping up as a drawn-out nail-biter of a US presidential election has instead resulted in a decisive victory. Donald Trump has won his race for the White House for a second time and also won the popular vote at the third time of asking. With a majority in the upper chamber of the US legislature, his Republican Party is on the verge of seizing an opportunity to shape an aggressive agenda of tax cuts, deregulation, and tariffs on trade. What this means for markets, a green industrial shift still dependent on supportive policy, and global governments facing another reset in their relationship with the world's largest economy is the subject of this week's Viewsroom.
Welcome back to the Viewsroom, the weekly podcast that invites you, the listener, into a lively debate with our fellow columnists about the biggest stories of the week. I'm your host, Jonathan Guilford.
And I'm Peter Thurlarson. So, it's Wednesday morning in the US, and Donald Trump has won his most convincing victory yet, riding a wave of support and financial backing from the likes of Tesla CEO Elon Musk. Also the first former president to be convicted of a felony, but he nonetheless won a broad-based shift among voters across the country who, it appears, were worried about inflation and immigration more than the sort of potential threats to democracy that some people thought Donald Trump opposed. So, Jonathan, have you caught up on some sleep? How does it look this morning to you?
Just the bare minimum, enough to just about keep functioning. I think that's kind of the case for everybody in the US right now who's following this. It's definitely not the result I think a lot of us expected, although given that polling was at a 50-50 toss-up, probably should have seen this within the realm of possibility. And it's interesting that you kind of mentioned the voter concerns point. We see exit polls with kind of a scrambled picture of what folks were thinking about out there. NBC certainly had concern about democracy as the top issue, which indicates that something has shifted, perhaps, about the way that people consider these issues. You look to where stock indexes are indicated, rallying sharply in the US, as are treasury yields and crypto.
Yeah, there's no concern in the no concern in the financial markets at all. I mean,
exactly.
The dollar's up, stocks are up, treasury yields are up, Bitcoin is up.
No, this is the thing. We seem to be in something of a honeymoon period the second time around for Trump, even though you would think we have a pretty good indication of what's coming. And so to take us a little bit deeper into that, let's bring our guests in on the conversation, no doubt also addled by a long night of following the results. With us today, we have Gabe Rubin, Breakingviews correspondent in Washington, D.C., and Laura Silver-Laughlin, our U.S. editor. Gabe, Lauren, welcome.
Thanks for having us.
So let's just step back here for a second and ask the obvious question. Looking at the results, what happened here? What delivered Trump this victory?
Yeah, we'll know a lot more when we dig into exit polls and a lot of the more granular data. But the initial view seems to be that Trump did better almost everywhere. He shifted places to the right. He shifted Latino men. He shifted voters in blue states. He shifted voters in red states. This looks to be a broad-based change and can't just be pinned on one particular region or one particular demographic, at least so far in the data.
So just to clarify a few things, Gabe, because I mean, obviously the focus is always on the presidential election, but there's also there are big votes last night for both houses of Congress. And obviously that explain to us a little bit what's happened there, and also how that affects what the sort of picture is going to be for the next few years.
Yeah, so with the caveat that at this hour, some of these races have not yet been called, it looks what we do know for sure is that Republicans will take control of the U.S. Senate. We don't yet know the margin. Some of those states' races are still outstanding, but they will certainly have control, and they'll have a bit of a breathing room. It won't just be a one-seat margin because they were able to flip some of the more thought to be difficult races last night. And as of this recording, the House of Representatives has not been determined. Control of the House of Representatives has not been determined. And that is a very tight race with only a couple of flips as of this moment. And it was already tight coming into the election. So control there is not yet known. But Trump, with both houses of Congress behind him, is a lot different than Trump with divided government because of what he would be able to do legislatively. And, control of the Senate will help him get his team in place. It'll help him appoint judges. But control of both houses of Congress in the U.S. system really opens up his options legislatively and to sort of roll back a lot of the regulations and spending that was put in place under the Biden administration.
I want to pop in here, too, because, it looks as of now like this is a massive mandate for the Republicans and a huge loss on a lot of levels for the Democrats. But going back to your question, Jonathan, about sort of how did we get here? It's important to pull back the lens and remember, when Harris entered the race and what led to her entering. And she did make up huge amounts of ground relative to Biden. But there was, I think, a lot of voters who were frustrated with the Democratic Party and how they handled Biden coming out of the race. And so they were really starting on the back foot to begin with. While we're all sort of surprised, perhaps there's a lot of people who are surprised. I mean, if you think about it in that context, it's actually really not that surprising of a result.
Right. And that's what I kind of wonder, because you see this sort of, I think, mixed outcome from, and, proviso here, the one shouldn't follow the exit polls too closely. But you see this really kind of scrambled outcome in terms of concerns from voters and kind of what the partisan valence of that was. I mean, it seems like the clear thing early on is a lot of folks seem to think they're going to get what they want and maybe not the things that they should be afraid that they might get. So we're seeing really kind of euphoric reaction in U.S. markets thus far this morning. And while it's easy to see through to a wave of deregulation, industry-friendly agency appointments, tax cuts, etc., we know to a certain extent what Trump is, and Trump is a trade warrior. Trump is a person who is unpredictable. Like, how do we reason through what we're seeing in the reaction from markets to this one?
It seems that both markets and voters, to a large degree, think that Trump will do the things they want him to do and won't do the things that he says he's going to do. There seems to be this comes up in both memories of what happened during the first Trump administration in terms of remembering the positive aspects and not some of the negative ones, which perhaps helped him win last night. But also in terms of what's going to happen in a second term, and people saying that he will not put in his most restrictive versions of his trade policy, that he would not be able to do some of the things he's saying in terms of restricting, broadcast licenses or going after his political enemies using tools of the state. So people at this point, it seems, are really hoping for the things they like about Trump to come true and for the things that they don't like so much about Trump to not come to fruition so they can ignore them.
I mean, the people who drive the markets, investors, power brokers, global leaders, they are picking up where they left off in 2020, forgetting that the types of policies that Trump puts in place mean that markets are very easy come, easy go. So, they're thinking, tariffs get, if regulation gets rolled back and we get lower interest rates and a bunch of money gets pumped into the system in ways that help companies, then stocks are going to go up. And that's exactly what we're seeing happen. But we know very quickly the wind gets taken out of that. There's, sort of a grifter trade between Bitcoin and SPACs and everything else that we covered in 2020 and 2021 that does some real damage on the market. And if you think of banking regulation getting rolled back, for example, it might take a few years for the impact of that to come through, but it is not a positive thing for the markets overall.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there's definitely a bit of magical thinking here. And it was quite interesting. I was in Washington a couple of weeks ago and, talking to people there. It's a total dismissal of the idea that what Trump had been saying on the campaign trail about tariffs was something that he was actually going to do. Definitely not the 20% blanket tariff on all imports, and maybe not even the 60% tariff on Chinese imports. It's all like it's an opening gambit in a negotiation. People will have to come to him and cut a deal. That's what he likes doing. He likes doing deals. So don't worry about this stuff. None of this is going to happen. But I think this. We'll see. We'll see how that works out. I think there are different people in his who could potentially be in his administration who have different thoughts on this. There are people who are very kind of skeptical about tariffs, but there are people like Robert Lighthizer, who are absolute believers in this. So it's also going to be interesting to see who gets the upper hand. I just wanted to turn to ask you guys about sort of some of the specific sort of policies and industries that might get affected here. And we've obviously been looking at this question before the election because there was always this possibility that Trump would make a comeback. So if we think about, for example, Gabe, about green industry, the shift to electric vehicles, the Inflation Reduction Act, what happens to that? Chip manufacturers are getting billions in subsidies from bills passed under Biden. Do those things survive in a second Trump administration?
So this is sort of a classic example of getting what you hope from Trump and not what he's actually saying, because and certainly what his allies are saying. I mean, just this week, just earlier, in the waning days of the campaign, you had Speaker of the House, top legislative leader Mike Johnson, a Republican, a Trump ally, who may keep his job. That's uncertain at the moment, but he very well may keep his job. Saying that they would repeal the CHIPS Act, these subsidies for semiconductor manufacturers, and they would go after, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was the major green legislation passed under Biden. It's not clear that actually would happen legislatively. Mike Johnson has a strew of legislative failures behind him where he failed to count the votes properly as a sort of novice leader in the Republican Party. But, you have a lot of Republicans who really like these policies that have delivered tons of jobs and factories and investment into their districts. And many of them have urged Johnson and Republican leaders to keep them in place. So what ends up happening with that will be sort of an intra-party fight for the Republicans to decide which of these subsidies, which of these investment programs and regulatory systems stay in place, because, they're actually somewhat beneficial, even if they're ideologically, not in line with Republican priorities. So that will be a big fight within the party.
I mean, we talked about this too, Peter, the other day. I think we were talking about America for Americans, and how the idea of the sort of globalist president that Obama was not really an option in this election. And, the question is, what kind of flavor are we going to have here? And we know the one thing that we can predict about Trump, he's very unpredictable. What we can predict about Trump is that he's a protectionist and he's going to put tariffs onto, everything that he possibly can. He's going to make an enemy of China, and that's going to reshape the auto market, among other things. And so we can bank on that market and sort of the green energy market completely changing under this administration, I think.
Right. And I mean, it's kind of interesting, speaking of the car market, it's hard not to think about Elon Musk and the role that he played in this campaign, right? Putting in dollars, organizing efforts, which now he gets to kind of point to as proving his value to the coalition. And then you also have all of these other folks, the cadre of tech investors led by Mark Andreessen. You have Blackstone boss Steve Schwartzman. A lot of folks who kind of broke with the general quietness on this election to really kind of throw in with Trump. I know, Lauren, you've been kind of taking the temperature of a lot of industry leaders in the past week or so. What do you think this outcome means for them?
I mean, there's Trump, and then there's everybody. There's Musk, and then there's everybody else, right? And Musk had everything at stake in this election, which is sort of bizarre because typically corporate chieftains don't want to put everything at stake, but he did. He had his auto business, he has his social media business, he has the future of AI, and so he was very much putting his money where his interests are, and he won. He came out a victor in this without a doubt. I spent the last week or so, 10 days, calling around. I sent a very sort of wide brush of all the corporate leaders that I know, big and small, all over the country, running companies of different sizes, to try to get a sense of where their head was at, all different ideologies. And these are sources I've had for a very long time, so they were very candid. The conclusion I came to at the end of last week was that Trump was going to win in a landslide based on talking to them. And I mean, a lot of people were thinking that too, but the reason why I believed that was true was because the reasons that they gave were all very credible and all very different. And I think at the end of the day, what they've realized is they've effectively lost a lot of power in how they put their finger on the scales of U.S. politics. They used to think that they could donate money and, sway outcomes. And that might be true to an extent. But really, what they need to do is worry about Trump's backlash. And so you've seen Musk act the way he has, probably out of fear more than hope. And that's really just a bottomless pit for him and for everybody else. And I do think that in the future, we're going to see a lot more CEOs start to kowtow to Trump because they're concerned about how he's going to retaliate.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, it does take you back a little bit to the first Trump administration, though, where, you saw some quite serious people who kind of went into the administration in various senior jobs. Gary Cohn, formerly of Goldman Sachs, for example, Wilbur Ross, people who kind of went into the administration, thinking they could have some influence and maybe do some things. And, it didn't really work out terribly well for many of them. And actually, when you consider this election, it's really striking that there were very, very few people who had direct exposure to Trump in his first administration who were willing to endorse him the second time round. Like almost as if you've had close-up experience of working with Trump, you almost kind of stay away from that. So, it'll be interesting to see whether this works out better for the likes of Elon Musk. I mean, I have my doubts somehow.
It's true. No, I mean, there's no bigger fall from grace than Rudy Giuliani, right? I mean, if you can call it grace. But, I mean, he's in complete financial ruin at this point. So Trump has protected himself. He's not, he's convicted of a felony. These other charges, I'm assuming, will get dropped at this point. But anybody else from Scaramucci to Cohn is struggling to get themselves back on their feet. And everybody in in New York City and Wall Street, there's nobody who doesn't talk about that. Everybody knows that. So you're right. I mean, it's not hard to think of a falling out happening in the very near future between Elon Musk and Donald Trump. And then the question is, where does Musk turn? Does he turn to China? Does he turn to Xi? There are much bigger global implications at this point with a Trump presidency and the people he surrounds him with than before.
Yeah. I want to just make sure that we don't forget the rest of the world. I'm sitting here in London, kind of, and this is an election that's been followed very closely by lots of people in Europe, in Asia, and elsewhere, because it has real consequences for them. I mean, it's impossible, obviously, to read the runes on this, but just sort of, if you're thinking, Gabe, about sort of the international consequences of a second Trump presidency, what are the sort of the hotspots or the flashpoints that we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, the first, that would probably be of most interest to our readers and our listeners is, of course, trade policy and what's, and just the continued slide away from the WTO globalization consensus that previously existed, and has been crumbling since the global financial crisis, and certainly has accelerated under Trump and under Biden. So that would be the first thing. What does Trump get to do on trade policy? The other would, of course, be that Trump has been, Trump is not a good ally. He demands, he doesn't have a lot of appreciation for the history of U.S. alliances, especially in Europe. Doesn't really put a lot of stock into that, especially in the way that Biden is so, reverential towards European allies, and really understands, the importance of NATO in the post-war order. Trump wants European countries to boost their defense spending. They have done that in recent years. They will probably, just as the war in Ukraine was a major wake-up call for European powers that, they're at risk. A re-election of Donald Trump, which, they saw coming, will continue to push Europe to try to be more self-sufficient, to try to, rebuild its industrial capacity, especially for weapons, but also for renewable energy. And that's going to be a really, really uphill climb, because once you lose your industrial base, it's not so easy to get it back. So that won't happen overnight. And then in Asia, really the question is, how bad does the new Cold War between the U.S. and China get? Obviously, this is not a new phenomenon, but under Trump, it stands to get significantly worse. And does it do the threats that the Chinese have, put out and sort of pursued in the South China Sea or elsewhere in the Indo-Pacific? Does that result in actual conflict over Taiwan? So the number of possible black swan events here is sort of mind-boggling and terrifying. And I'm sure every world leader and corporate chieftain around the world is thinking about those things this morning. But yeah, no, just a huge set of risks that are completely different than the set of risks that they would have been dealing with had Harris won the election.
Right. Okay. And I think that's probably that point of uncertainty and fear. It seems like a adequate place to tail it off. So, Gabe, Lauren, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the Viewsroom.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in. This podcast was produced by Oliver Taslich in London. You can listen to a new episode of The Viewsroom on the Reuters app or your favorite podcast platform every Thursday. Also, don't forget to tune into our sister podcast, The Big View, every Tuesday, as well as the other great podcasts from the Reuters team. If you liked what you heard, please follow The Viewsroom and let us know what you thought. And check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakingviews.com and reuters.com.